In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in on the shattered remnants of Nazi Germany, one man found himself thrust into a position he never anticipated. Karl Dönitz, the architect of Germany's U-boat warfare, became the last head of state of the Third Reich. For 23 days he held a title that meant nothing, commanding a government that existed only on paper. Then came surrender, arrest, and silence. But when he finally broke that silence in his first extensive interview after the war, the words he chose revealed something far more complex than simple defeat. They exposed a mind caught between justification and denial, between military pride and moral blindness. What Dönitz said in that interview would haunt historical analysis for decades, not because of what he admitted, but because of what he couldn't see in himself. The interview took place in the summer of 1945, just months after Germany's unconditional surrender. Dönitz sat in Allied custody, no longer the Grand Admiral who had commanded hundreds of submarines across the Atlantic, no longer the man Hitler had chosen as his successor in those final desperate hours in the Berlin bunker. He was now simply a prisoner, awaiting whatever judgment the victorious powers would impose. The interviewer was an American intelligence officer tasked with documenting the Nazi leadership's perspective on the war's final chapter. The setting was austere, the atmosphere tense. But Dönitz approached the conversation with a peculiar confidence, as if he believed he could explain his way through history's judgment. What makes this interview historically significant isn't the new information it provided about military operations. By 1945, the Allies already knew the strategic details of Germany's naval campaign. What matters is the psychological portrait that emerged, the self-image of a man who saw himself as a professional officer caught in circumstances beyond his control. Dönitz spoke with the precision of a military mind, careful with his language, deliberate in his framing. He wasn't confessing in any religious or moral sense. He was presenting his case, constructing a narrative where duty trumped all other considerations. From the opening moments, Dönitz established his core defense. He was a naval officer, not a political figure. He had joined the Kriegsmarine in 1910, long before Hitler's rise to power, and had built his career on tactical innovation and operational effectiveness. His U-boat campaigns, he insisted, were legitimate military operations conducted according to the established rules of naval warfare. When pressed about the toll on Allied merchant shipping and the sailors who died in the frigid Atlantic waters, he showed no remorse. War was war, he explained. The British had blockaded Germany in the First World War, starving civilians. The Americans had waged unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. Why should Germany be judged differently for doing what every naval power did when survival was at stake? This rhetorical strategy would become central to his defense at Nuremberg, but in this first interview it appeared rawer, less rehearsed. Dönitz genuinely seemed to believe that tactical equivalence erased moral distinction. He pointed to specific incidents where Allied forces had conducted operations that, by his logic, violated the same principles they now accused him of breaking: the firebombing of German cities. The blockades that prevented food from reaching civilian populations. In his mind, these weren't deflections, but proof that war itself was the crime, not any particular method of waging it. Yet even as he constructed this defense, cracks appeared in his narrative. When asked about his relationship with Hitler, Dönitz's tone shifted. He described the Führer with a mixture of respect and distance, calling him a leader of exceptional willpower who had restored Germany's strength after the humiliation of Versailles. But he carefully avoided endorsing Nazi ideology directly. He had been a military man, he repeated, focused on naval operations, not party politics. This distinction would have been more convincing if his own words hadn't contradicted it. Allied intelligence had already documented Dönitz's speeches to his crews, addresses filled with Nazi rhetoric, calls for absolute loyalty to Hitler, declarations that the U-boat force represented the spirit of National Socialism. The interviewer pushed on this contradiction. How could he claim political neutrality when his own communications demonstrated enthusiastic alignment with the regime? Dönitz's response revealed the mental gymnastics required to maintain his self-image. Those speeches, he explained, were necessary to maintain morale. His men needed ideological motivation to face the terrible conditions of submarine warfare. Whether he personally believed every word was irrelevant. His duty was to keep his forces fighting effectively. This justification raised more questions than it answered. If ideology was merely a tool for Dönitz, what did that say about his actual beliefs? Was cynical manipulation of Nazi rhetoric better or worse than genuine conviction? The most revealing segment of the interview dealt with his final weeks as Germany's head of state. Hitler's decision to name Dönitz as his successor came as a shock to many, including Dönitz himself. He had been loyal, certainly, but he wasn't part of the inner circle of Nazi leadership. He lacked the ideological purity of Himmler or Goebbels. Perhaps that's precisely why Hitler chose him. In those last moments, Hitler may have wanted someone who could negotiate surrender without the burden of being too closely identified with the party's worst crimes. Or perhaps Hitler simply saw in Dönitz the same thing Dönitz saw in himself, a military professional who would follow orders to the end. Dönitz described his actions after assuming power with bureaucratic precision. He had attempted to negotiate separate surrenders with the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets in the East, hoping to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity. This strategy failed, of course. The Allies demanded unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. But Dönitz presented this effort as evidence of his pragmatism and his concern for German lives, rather than what it actually was: a final, desperate attempt to exploit the emerging tensions between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. What Dönitz carefully avoided discussing was his knowledge of Nazi crimes against civilians. When the conversation turned toward the concentration camps and the systematic murder of Jews, his answers became vague and defensive. He claimed ignorance, insisting that military officers focused on military matters had no detailed knowledge of what happened in occupied territories or within Germany's camp system. This assertion strained credibility. By 1945, evidence of the Holocaust was overwhelming and widely known among German leadership. The interviewer didn't let it pass unchallenged, pointing out that communication within the German military and government would have made complete ignorance impossible. Dönitz retreated to a different defense. Even if rumors existed, he said, military officers couldn't verify such things. They had to trust that civilian authorities handled civilian matters appropriately. This answer revealed the moral architecture that allowed the Nazi system to function: compartmentalization, willful ignorance, and the abdication of moral responsibility through appeal to hierarchy. Dönitz wasn't unique in this regard. Countless German military officers would offer similar defenses. But hearing it stated so clearly, so matter-of-factly, in the immediate aftermath of discovery, demonstrated how deeply this mindset had taken root. The interviewer then raised a question that cut to the heart of military ethics. At what point does following orders become participation in atrocity? Dönitz's response was uncompromising. An officer who refuses orders undermines military discipline and endangers his comrades. The chain of command exists for essential reasons. Without it, armies collapse into chaos. Therefore, obedience isn't just a military virtue. It's a moral imperative in its own right. This philosophy had been drilled into German military culture for generations, reaching back through Prussian traditions of discipline and duty. But applied to the Nazi context, it became a formula for enabling genocide while maintaining a sense of personal honor. What makes Dönitz's words particularly unsettling is their complete absence of self-doubt. He showed no signs of grappling with the possibility that his framework for understanding duty and honor had led him to serve evil. Instead, he presented his choices as inevitable, the only logical actions available to a professional officer. This certainty suggests something important about how certain personalities navigate moral catastrophe. Not through anguished soul-searching, but through the construction of intellectual systems that externalize guilt and preserve self-image. As the interview progressed, Dönitz discussed the U-boat campaign's evolution. In the war's early years, his submarines had devastated Allied shipping with relatively few losses. He had developed the wolf pack tactics that overwhelmed convoy defenses through coordinated group attacks. He spoke of these innovations with evident pride, describing them as brilliant solutions to tactical problems. But as Allied countermeasures improved, especially through advances in radar and code-breaking, German U-boats began suffering catastrophic losses. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany. Dönitz had continued sending crews to sea even as survival rates plummeted, even as it became clear that the campaign could no longer achieve strategic objectives. The interviewer asked the obvious question: knowing that crews faced near certain death, why continue operations? Dönitz's answer revealed his purely military calculus. Even doomed U-boats tied down Allied resources and diverted ships and aircraft from other theaters. Every convoy that had to be protected, every destroyer assigned to submarine hunting, represented assets not available for the invasion of Europe. Therefore, continuing the U-boat war remained strategically rational, regardless of the human cost to his own crews. This cold logic was militarily coherent, but morally hollow. It reduced men to chess pieces, expendable resources in a grand strategic game. Yet Dönitz also expressed something approaching grief when discussing his fallen submariners. He acknowledged their courage, their willingness to face impossible odds. Some historians have noted this emotional element as evidence that Dönitz wasn't purely mechanical in his thinking, that he felt genuine connection to the men under his command. But this observation raises a troubling question. Which is worse, sending men to pointless deaths while feeling nothing, or sending them to pointless deaths while feeling sorrow? The sentiment didn't change the decision. It only complicated Dönitz's moral profile, adding layers of contradiction to an already complex character. The interview also touched on Dönitz's views regarding Hitler's military judgment. This topic required careful navigation. Dönitz had publicly expressed absolute loyalty to the Führer throughout the war, but now he needed to distance himself from Germany's strategic disasters without appearing disloyal or opportunistic. He threaded this needle by praising Hitler's early instincts while subtly criticizing his later micromanagement. The Führer had been right to rebuild German military strength, Dönitz explained, right to challenge the Versailles restrictions. But as the war expanded and intensified, Hitler had increasingly interfered in operational decisions beyond his expertise. Generals and admirals found themselves unable to execute sound military strategy because of political constraints and Hitler's emotional responses to setbacks. This critique was self-serving but not entirely false. Hitler had indeed made catastrophic strategic errors, particularly after 1942. The invasion of the Soviet Union without securing the Western Front, the declaration of war on the United States, the refusal to allow tactical withdrawals even when they were militarily necessary. These decisions contributed enormously to Germany's defeat. But Dönitz's analysis conveniently omitted the fact that he and other military leaders had enabled these errors through their own unwillingness to push back more forcefully. They had traded strategic autonomy for personal advancement and professional privilege. When asked directly whether he bore any responsibility for Germany's defeat, Dönitz rejected the premise. Germany had lost, he explained, because of overwhelming material superiority on the Allied side, particularly American industrial capacity. No amount of German tactical brilliance could overcome the simple mathematics of production. The United States could build ships faster than U-boats could sink them, manufacture aircraft faster than German fighters could shoot them down. This factor analysis was accurate but incomplete. It ignored German strategic blunders, resource misallocation, and the moral collapse that undermined civilian morale and military cohesion. The most historically significant portion of the interview dealt with Dönitz's understanding of National Socialism's ultimate legacy. The interviewer pressed him on whether he recognized that Germany's actions, particularly the Holocaust, had created moral debts that would define the nation for generations. Dönitz's response demonstrated his inability or unwillingness to engage with this dimension. He spoke instead about reconstruction, about the practical challenges of feeding a devastated population and rebuilding destroyed cities. These were certainly real concerns, but they allowed him to sidestep the harder question of collective guilt and historical reckoning. This evasion wasn't unique to Dönitz. It represented a broader pattern among German military leaders in the immediate post-war period. The impulse to move forward without fully confronting the past, to treat Nazi crimes as somehow separate from the military's professional conduct. This distinction became central to the clean Wehrmacht myth that would persist for decades, the false narrative that the German armed forces had fought honorably while atrocities were committed by SS units and political operatives. Dönitz's interview helped establish this narrative's parameters. By emphasizing his identity as a naval officer first and foremost, by drawing sharp lines between military operations and political crimes, he created a template that others would adopt and elaborate. Yet even as Dönitz attempted to separate himself from Nazi criminality, his words occasionally revealed the opposite. He would slip into language that echoed party rhetoric, refer to enemies using terminology that betrayed ideological conviction rather than purely military assessment. These moments were brief, quickly corrected, but they exposed the depth of intellectual and moral contamination. A person cannot serve a totalitarian system for years, rise to its highest ranks, benefit from its structure, and remain unaffected by its worldview. The ideology seeps in through language, through habitual thought patterns, through the constant reinforcement of certain ways of understanding reality. The interviewer noted Dönitz's apparent lack of remorse, not just for specific actions, but for his role in the broader catastrophe. Shouldn't he feel some guilt, some sense of responsibility for the millions of deaths? Dönitz's answer was telling. He acknowledged the tragedy of war, but refused personal responsibility for anything beyond his specific operational decisions. He had commanded submarines, not concentration camps. He had sunk ships, not murdered civilians. This compartmentalized conscience allowed him to acknowledge abstract tragedy while denying personal culpability. This psychological mechanism deserves closer examination because it reveals something fundamental about how ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil. Dönitz wasn't a sadist. He didn't personally kill anyone. He made decisions in conference rooms and transmitted orders through proper channels. The distance between his actions and their consequences, sailors drowning in the cold Atlantic, supply ships failing to reach besieged cities, resources diverted to submarine construction that could have fed starving populations. This distance allowed him to maintain a self-image as a professional doing his duty. The bureaucratic and technological mediation of violence enabled moral detachment. As the interview drew toward its conclusion, Dönitz was asked about Germany's future. What did he hope would emerge from the ruins? His answer mixed pragmatism with an undercurrent of nationalism. Germany needed to rebuild, to regain its place among civilized nations. The German people were hard-working, disciplined, capable. Given the opportunity, they would reconstruct their country and contribute to European stability. This vision was forward-looking but notably absent of any acknowledgement that Germany's reconstruction required moral transformation, not just physical and economic recovery. Dönitz imagined restoration, not redemption. The interviewer's final question cut through the carefully constructed defenses. Did Dönitz regret anything? There was a long pause, according to the transcript. Then Dönitz offered an answer that would become infamous among historians studying this period. He regretted that Germany had lost. He regretted the suffering of the German people. He regretted that his U-boat crews had died in such numbers. But he expressed no regret for choosing to serve Hitler, no regret for the fundamental direction of his life and career. This absence of deeper remorse revealed the limits of his moral imagination. He could feel sorrow for consequences, but not guilt for choices. This interview, conducted when memories were fresh and before legal strategies were fully developed, provided historians with a remarkably clear window into the mindset of Nazi military leadership. Later, at Nuremberg, Dönitz would refine his arguments, present more carefully calculated defenses. His lawyers would develop sophisticated legal theories about the limits of command responsibility and the precedents for submarine warfare. But this first interview captured something rawer, more honest in its contradictions. It showed a man who genuinely believed in his own righteousness, who had constructed an elaborate intellectual framework to justify his service to a criminal regime. The Allied officers who conducted these early interviews were often surprised by what they encountered. Many had expected to find either fanatics or broken men consumed by guilt. Dönitz was neither. He was calm, articulate, defensive, but not hysterical. He presented himself as a reasonable person caught in unreasonable circumstances, a professional who had done his job to the best of his ability under difficult conditions. This self-presentation was precisely what made him dangerous as a historical figure, because it normalized collaboration with atrocity. If someone like Dönitz, educated, professional, articulate, could serve the Nazi regime without apparent moral crisis, then what did that say about human nature's capacity for rationalization? The interview ended without resolution, because no such resolution was possible. Dönitz would face trial at Nuremberg, where he would be convicted of war crimes and crimes against peace, though notably not crimes against humanity. He would serve 10 years in Spandau prison, writing memoirs that continued the self-justification begun in this first interview. He would live until 1980, long enough to see Germany divided and rebuilt, long enough to witness debates about collective guilt and historical responsibility. But he never substantially altered his fundamental perspective on his own role and choices. What Dönitz confessed in his first post-war interview wasn't criminality in the legal sense, though he would eventually be convicted of that. What he confessed was something more insidious. The ease with which duty can become moral blindness, the way professional identity can eclipse ethical judgment, the comfort of systemic thinking that diffuses responsibility until it evaporates entirely. He confessed, without realizing he was confessing, that he had never seriously questioned whether his loyalty was deserved, whether the orders he followed were just, whether his definition of honor had any relationship to genuine morality. The historical significance of this interview extends beyond Dönitz himself. It represents a broader phenomenon that societies must understand if they hope to prevent similar catastrophes. How do ordinary people who aren't inherently evil end up enabling systems of mass violence? The answer lies partly in the mechanisms Dönitz demonstrated: the compartmentalization of knowledge, the prioritization of professional duty over moral reflection, the construction of narratives that preserve self-image while excusing complicity. These patterns recur across different contexts and eras whenever institutional structures allow individuals to participate in harm while maintaining psychological distance from consequences. In the decades since this interview, scholars have returned to Dönitz's words repeatedly, mining them for insights into the Nazi mind and the broader questions of collaboration and responsibility. Some have tried to rehabilitate his reputation, arguing that he was indeed a professional officer rather than a committed Nazi. Others have used his example to demonstrate how professional ethics can become complicit with evil when divorced from larger moral frameworks. Both readings contain partial truths, but neither fully captures the complexity of what his words reveal. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Dönitz's first post-war interview is how ordinary it makes the extraordinary. He doesn't sound like a monster. He sounds like a military officer explaining strategic decisions, a professional defending his competence, a man trying to make sense of a catastrophic defeat. The language is bureaucratic, the tone measured, the logic internally consistent within its own narrow parameters. This ordinariness reminds us that the greatest crimes in history are rarely committed by those who see themselves as villains. They're committed by those who have convinced themselves they're doing their duty, serving their country, following orders, making the hard choices that leadership requires. When future generations study this period, trying to understand how a civilized nation descended into genocidal barbarism, they will return to documents like this interview. Not because it provides shocking revelations, but because it shows the mundane reality of moral collapse. Dönitz's words demonstrate that evil doesn't always announce itself with theatrical malice. Sometimes it arrives in the language of professionalism, wrapped in the rhetoric of duty and national interest, justified through technical arguments about strategic necessity. The horror isn't that Dönitz was inhuman. The horror is that he was all too human, displaying capacities for rationalization and moral blindness that exist in varying degrees within all of us. The interview concluded with administrative details about his custody and upcoming legal proceedings. Dönitz asked about his family, inquired about conditions in occupied Germany, made requests for reading materials. These mundane concerns, following immediately after discussions of submarine warfare and mass death, captured the jarring disconnection at the heart of his worldview. He could transition seamlessly from defending his role in industrial-scale naval combat to worrying about personal comfort, showing no sense of contradiction. This ability to operate simultaneously in radically different emotional registers speaks to the compartmentalized nature of his psychological experience. What Karl Dönitz confessed in his first post-war interview ultimately was the terrifying adequacy of his own conscience. He had served a regime responsible for unprecedented atrocity, yet he felt no deep guilt, no transformative remorse. He had contributed to the machinery of war and oppression, yet he slept soundly, maintained his dignity, saw himself as fundamentally decent. This is the confession that should haunt us most. Not the admission of monstrous acts, but the revelation of how normal conscience can accommodate the abnormal, how ordinary moral frameworks can bend to justify the unjustifiable, how a person can participate in historical evil and emerge with self-image intact. The echoes of this interview continue to resonate through contemporary discussions of war crimes, command responsibility, and moral accountability. Every time military officers claim they were following orders, every time professionals argue they were just doing their jobs, every time bureaucrats insist they were merely implementing policy, Dönitz's voice whispers through history. His defense has been repeated in countless contexts, from military tribunals to corporate scandals to political controversies. The specific details change, but the underlying logic remains constant. The attempt to separate professional conduct from moral judgment, to claim technical competence while denying ethical responsibility. Understanding what Dönitz revealed in this interview requires accepting uncomfortable truths about human psychology and social systems. It requires acknowledging that most participants in large-scale atrocity aren't sadistic psychopaths, but ordinary individuals operating within corrupted institutional frameworks. It requires recognizing that professional pride, institutional loyalty, and personal ambition can combine to override moral intuitions that might otherwise restrain destructive behavior. Most importantly, it requires admitting that the distance between Dönitz's choices and our own is smaller than we'd prefer to believe, that given the wrong circumstances and pressures, many people could find themselves constructing similar justifications for similar complicity. The final words of the interview, according to the transcript, were Dönitz expressing confidence that history would vindicate him, that future generations would understand he had been a military officer doing his duty in difficult times. He was wrong, of course. History has not been kind to Karl Dönitz, but neither has it fully grasped the lessons his words offer. We remember him as a Nazi war criminal, convicted and imprisoned. We rarely examine the psychological mechanisms that allowed him to see himself so differently. We're more comfortable with simple narratives of good and evil than with the complex reality of how decent people enable indecent systems. This first interview stands as a historical document of profound importance, not because it changed our understanding of military strategy or revealed hidden facts about the war's conduct, but because it captured a mindset in its most unguarded moment, before legal strategies had been perfected, before the full weight of historical judgment had settled. In those hours of conversation, Dönitz revealed the architecture of complicity, the structure of denial, the logic of atrocity. He confessed, without meaning to confess, how a person could participate in catastrophe while maintaining an image of personal honor. That confession remains one of the most chilling and instructive documents to emerge from the wreckage of the Second World War. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.